Hi guys, we are discussing the book The Rigvedic People by Acharya B.B. Lal, and we are at the last end of the 6th chapter, which is a gigantic chapter and it's almost a book in itself. The chapter is called From Pit Dwellings to Fortified Cities, The Evolution of Civilization in the Saraswati Basin. And in this section we start what is called the stage 4 of that civilization, finally the citadel and the lower town. Full-fledged urbanization. The most distinctive feature of stage 4 in terms of town planning was the coming into being of two clear-cut segments of settlement, which have been called the citadel and lower town. Also to be noted was the emergence of a system of writing, of weights and measures, and of seals and ceilings. All these appear to have emerged along with the development of trade, both internal as well as external. The net result was a high level of affluence as resulted by specialized buildings and a rich harvest of antiquities. We shall continue with the site of Banavali, where we saw a while ago the emergence of the two parts of the settlement. A. Banavali. In the context of Banavali, it may be noted that while the concept of two parts of the settlement had emerged, namely a citadel or acropolis and a lower town, the two parts were not separately located, as we shall see shortly in the case of Kalibangan. These were contiguous to each other, there being a common peripheral wall for them on the southern side. The total area covered by these contiguous parts was approximately 400 by 400 meters. With the southern wall as the common base, the citadel or acropolis formed a sort of semi-ellipse and occupied nearly half of the entire area. The peripheral wall enclosing the citadel varied in thickness from 5.4 meters to 7 meters. On the northern side, there was a ramp paved with kiln-fired bricks, which connected the citadel with the lower town. On the eastern side, there were two bastions, near one of which there was a narrow exit. Within the citadel, the streets ran north-south and east-west, forming a grid on the plan. It may incidentally be mentioned that though the area excavated was limited, no platforms were identified within the citadel, as was the case with Kalibangan. The streets within the lower town, however, did not follow the typical grid pattern. Instead, starting from a piazza which was located in front of an entrance through the eastern side of the peripheral wall, a series of streets radiated in southern and western and northwestern directions. Emerging from the eastern side of this piazza, there was also a street which ran along the western face of the peripheral wall, reaching on the one hand the northeastern corner and on the other the southeastern end. The eastern peripheral wall was provided on the exterior with a series of square bastions. A very important feature noted on the exterior of the peripheral wall was that of a moat, M-O-A-T. There was evidently no problem about feeding this moat with running water, since not far from the southern side of the settlement there was the river Saraswati, whose dry bed can still be seen. That provision of moats around fortifications was a normal practice in ancient times, may be seen from the excavated sites of Shishupalgarh, ascribable to 5th to 6th century BCE. The houses were made of mud bricks and had the usual pattern of having a courtyard on the sides of which were located the living rooms. Sometimes the rooms were also paved with mud bricks. In one of the houses, the toilet court was provided with a wash basin placed on a higher place in a corner near the drain, which carried off the wastewater into a sewell jar placed outside on the street. The provision of alcove in the thickness of the walls was another noteworthy feature. Also to be noted was the presence of an apsidal structure which was associated with fire altars, a feature about which we shall discuss in detail when we deal with the remains at Kalibangan. Banavali yielded a fairly rich harvest of antiquities. In one of the houses were found beads made of gold, carnelian, lapis lazuli, etc., besides tiny weights which may have been used for weighing these precious objects. No less interesting was the discovery of a, quote, touchstone bearing gold streaks of different hues, end quote, In this context, it needs to be stated that the use of touchstone for testing the purity of gold is prevalent even to this day in India. Now, Kalibangan. The reader has already been introduced to the location etc. of the site above when we were dealing with the stage 3 of the cultural evolution in the Saraswati basins, as you can see in my previous videos on this topic. This is by far the most extensively excavated site in the valley. As already mentioned, located on the left bank of the Saraswati, it consists of 3 mounds lying within an overall perimeter of about 1.5 to 2 kilometers. Beginning from the west, the mounds are KLB1, KLB2 and KLB3, the first 2 of which have respectively been named the Citadel and the Lower Town. It may be recalled that the stage 3 settlement at Kalibangan had to be abandoned because of an earthquake around 2700 BCE. Where exactly these people had moved to it is difficult to say, but they did return to the site after a gap of about a century, around 2600 BCE. During this crucial interval, however, they had developed a new concept about the layout of the settlement. There were now 2 clear-cut parts, both conceptually and physically. Taking advantage of the height provided by the earlier mound of stage 3, the returnees sited their citadel on it. In it, there lived perhaps the elites or rulers, by whatever designation they may have then gone. On the other hand, those who occupied the lower town, which actually did come up on a lower ground, namely the natural soil some 40 meters to east of the citadel, appear to have been the less privileged ones in the emerging socio-political setup. The die had been cast in favor of a hierarchical society, which may ultimately have led to the latter-day Indian caste system, as we shall discuss a little later. The lower town. Like the citadel, to a description of which we shall come a little later, the lower town, though conceptually relegated to a lower status, was also surrounded by peripheral or fortification walls. These formed a parallelogram on plan, since while the eastern and western walls had been laid out along north-south, the northern wall was not. The wall on the southern side had been eroded, but it may be assumed to have run parallel to the northern one. The width of the lower town was found to have been 240 meters. Its length has to be conjectured since, as already mentioned, the peripheral wall on the southern side had been eroded. However, on the basis of the extant habitation remains on this side, it may well be that the north-south extent of the lower town was around 360 meters. The peripheral walls were made of mud bricks which measured 10 by 20 by 40 centimeters in the earlier stages, but were later replaced by those measuring 7.5 by 15 by 30 centimeters. In both cases, however, these were in the ratio of 1:2:4. It may be added that in stage 4 this had become the standard size and bricks in the ratio of 1:2:3 had become a story of the past. As seen from the front, the profile of the bricks was in alternate courses of headers and stretchers, something which has continued ever since. Kiln-fired bricks were used only sparingly. 2 exits were identified piercing the peripheral walls. One of these lay in the northwest corner, opening on the river side, and the other on the western side, providing an approach to the citadel on the west. It is likely that there were similar exits on the eastern and southern sides, but these were not identified. Inside the lower town, 4 major streets running all the way from north to south were identified, while some others may have run only halfway through. The east to west streets, however, did not run right across, but were staggered. A noteworthy point about the lanes and streets was their width. While the lane was only 1.8 meters in width, the streets measured successively 3.6, 5.4 and 7.2 meters, that is, in a set ratio of 1:2:3:4. It would be observed from these photographs, particularly the latter, that even though there were as many as 9 reconstructions of the walls, one after the other, there never was any encroachment on the street. The only features noted were small platforms adjacent to the entrances, which were doubtless a part of the original plan. It may well be added here that such platforms, chabutaras, are a part of house construction in the neighboring village even today, where this location has been discovered. These are used by the people for sitting and chit-chatting. At the crossing of the streets, wooden fender posts were affixed to the corner of the houses so that the same may be prevented from being damaged by passing vehicular traffic. Although there were no street drains in Kalibangan, like those at Mohenjo-daro, care was taken to ensure that the sewage from inside the houses duly discharged through a house drain into a large pot immediately on the exterior. And for all one can guess, arrangement must have been made by civic authorities to have the jars cleared up from time to time. The plan of an average house usually consisted of a courtyard around which were set the living rooms, except for the side through which there was an entrance from the neighboring street. These entrances were large enough to permit the entry of a bullock cart, which was parked in the courtyard. In the courtyard there was an elongated plinth of mud or mud bricks, on the top of which there were placed the lower parts of large-sized jars, which were filled with water for the animals to drink, a pattern continuing even to this day. In one of the houses there was a well, lined with wedge-shaped, kiln-fired bricks. Cooking was usually done in a corner of the courtyard, for which U-shaped chulhas, like the ones used even today, were provided. The rooms were sometimes paved with mud bricks. In one of the houses we noted a very interesting technique of making the floor damp-proof. First, a soling was given of highly fired, broken terracotta nodules, interspersed with charcoal. Over it was laid out a clay cover. This process was repeated as and when necessary. In the context of floors, however, attention may also be drawn to one made of kiln-fired bricks with intersecting circles. It appears that one of the rooms in the house was kept reserved for a kind of ritual associated with fire. On the floor there was a pit, roughly rectangular on plan, measuring about a meter in length, half a meter in width and 25 centimeters in depth. The corners were somewhat rounded and the sides plastered with mud. In the center there stood up a stele of clay, stele, of clay, often fired, measuring about 30 to 40 centimeters in height. Usually it was cylindrical, but sometimes could be faceted. Its diameter was about 10 to 15 centimeters. Within the pit there lay about half a dozen circular biconvex objects of clay, with a finger depression in the center. These have usually been called cakes. The pit was full of ash and charcoal, and its floor and sides had turned red because of contact with fire. In the absence of a better name, these features have been called fire altars. However, it must straightaway be stated that these have nothing to do with the fire altars of the Parsis. The citadel. We may now turn our attention to the citadel complex. As already mentioned, it was built on the ruins of the mound of stage 3, which gave it a height to oversee the lower town, at least physically, if not administratively. The builders of the peripheral walls of stage 4 utilized the extant peripheral walls of stage 3 on the western and northern sides. On the southern side, some minor adjustments were made, but on the eastern side, the wall was laid out further to the east so as to cover a much wider area. As finished, the citadel complex measured 240 meters from north to south and 120 meters from west to east, giving it length-width ratio of 2:1. The peripheral walls were reinforced by square bastions at the corners and elsewhere too. There was an exit in the northwest corner of the northern part, leading to the riverfront. In its eastern part too, there was another exit, providing access to the lower town, whose western peripheral wall also had an entry. Beautiful pictures. See some of these pictures. Look at this room. Look at the designs here. Look at this. The citadel complex was divided by a thick medial wall into two equal parts, one northern and the other southern, and it may at once be added that the two parts were functionally different. While the northern part had residential area houses, There were no houses at all in the southern part. Instead, there were large-sized platforms, which were separated from one another as well as from the peripheral walls by means of intermediary passages. Ravages of time and by men have told heavily on these platforms, but at least in 2 cases, it was possible to determine their use, which was ritualistic. It may incidentally be added here that the main entrance to the southern half, which was from the south, was in a stepped fashion, thereby forbidding any entry of vehicles, because there were steps. This seems to have been the right thing to do, since in a religious complex, pedestrians should be able to move about freely unbothered by vehicular traffic. There was another noteworthy feature. Adjacent to this entrance, there were blind holes in the ledge of the fortification wall. These were just wide enough to hold wooden posts, and it may not be too much to imagine that on these posts were mounted flags on certain special occasions. On one of the platforms there were contiguous fire altars running from north to south. Although a subsequent rain had destroyed some of the altars, it would appear that originally these were 7 in number. Whatever be the significance of that number, it may incidentally be recalled that a seal from Mohenjo-daro shows 7 devotees marching in a row in the lower register, the upper one depicting a deity within a peepal leaf enclosure. Although because of subsequent disturbances, the contents of these altars had been depleted, one could nevertheless find in some of them the remains of stele, S-T-E-L-E, cakes and charcoal, signifying that these served the same purpose as did the fire altars in the lower town discussed earlier. On the west of these altars, there lay the lower half of a jar in a pit containing ash and charcoal. It would appear that in it, fire was kept ready to be used in the altars. Another interesting feature was that of a north-south wall running behind the row of the fire altars. This would show that the persons using these altars had to face east while carrying out the ritual. Close by, on the northwest of the fire altars, there were a well and a bathing platform, further suggesting that a ceremonial bath prior to the performing of the ritual may have been a part of the ceremony. On another platform in the southern part of the citadel, there was a pit lined with kiln-fired bricks. It measured 1.5 by 1 meters and contained bovine bones and antlers, indicative of animal sacrifice. How the animal was carried to the sacrificial altar is indicated by engravings found on a terracotta cake at Kalibangan itself. The cake is broken, hence the complete picture is not available. Nevertheless, one may see on one side a figure which from its typical headgear would appear to be a deity, recalling for comparisons the famous Shiva figure on a seal from Mohenjo-daro. On the other side, there is an animal whose neck has been tied with a rope, which is held by a human being, perhaps in the process of carrying the animal to the sacrificial altar. That animal sacrifice was practiced by the authors of this civilization is also confirmed by a seal found at Harappa. It shows a Shiva-like figure seated in a yogic posture, in front of whom a man pierces a buffalo with a harpoon-like spear, evidently offering the animal to the deity. Yonis and lingers made out of stone have been discovered long ago at Mohenjo-daro, but doubts were cast on their identification. Kalibangan, however, has removed all such doubts by throwing up a composite specimen of linga cum yoni. Though made of terracotta, the composite piece exactly resembles examples of linga cum yoni worshipped in Hindu temples even today. To come back to the citadel complex, as mentioned earlier, the nature of the structures in the 2 halves of the citadel was different. Thus, in contrast to the series of platforms of the southern half, the northern part had large residential houses. These were located on the 2 sides of a street, which ran in a northwesterly direction leading to a gate fronting the river. It is surmised, though not proved, that in these houses there lived the elites and priests who supervised the rituals performed in the southern part of the citadel. Between these houses and the medieval partition wall, there was a long and wide passageway paved with mud bricks, and if imagination is allowed to have a free go, it may well be that priests and their entourage moved along this passageway in a procession and entered the southern half of the citadel through a stepped entrance which was already there. Now, disposal of the dead. We have not yet come across any evidence regarding the practice adopted by the people of stages 1, 2 and 3 for the disposal of the bodies of their dead ones. But surely there must have been some method, maybe burial, as practiced by their successors. However, for stage 4, we have enough evidence from Kalibangan and other places like Rakhigari and Farmana. The cemetery at Kalibangan lay some 200 meters to the west-southwest of the citadel. In this area, 3 different kinds of methods seem to have been associated with the disposal of the dead. They have been classified as types 1, 2 and 3. Of type 1, as many as 12 examples were exposed, which are basically similar to one another. However, here we illustrate and describe one grave, grave 29, which was somewhat more elaborate than others. At the ground level, a pit was dug, about 4 meters in length, half of that in width, and a little less than a meter in depth. Then its side walls were lined with mud bricks, which were plastered with 2 centimeter thick clay. Within this dressed up grave pit, the dead body was placed extended on its back, supine, with the head on the north and facing westwards. To the north of the head were placed 37 pots of all descriptions, including a large-sized S-shaped painted jar. Further, underneath the body, there lay another group of 35 pots. It may be observed that the plastered side walls and the large number of interred pots made this grave stand out from the others. The plastered side walls and the large number of interred pots. In other words, the person buried in this particular grave perhaps enjoyed a somewhat higher status than did those buried in the other graves. At the same time, it cannot be said that he was a royal personality. Kalibangan lacks the really royal graves encountered in contemporary West Asian and Egyptian civilizations. At best, the person interred in grave 29 may be said to have been the first among equals. Interspersed with graves of type 1 were the graves of type 2, of which 6 examples were excavated. However, these were completely devoid of skeletal remains, complete or even fractional. At the same time, the grave pit was as large as in the graves of type 1 and was also oriented north-south. In fact, in one case it measured as much as 5 by 1.5 meters on plan and 1.5 meters in depth. Because of its unusual depth, even steps were provided in it. On the floor of the pit, a large number of pots were found. In some examples, besides pottery, shell bangles and beads were also found. Overlying these objects and pottery, there were a series of bands of sand and clay, indicating that the grave pit remained open for some time. It is difficult to be sure of the precise purpose served by the graves of type 2, but if a guess is at all to be hazarded, it may well be that the skeleton was first laid out in these graves and after some ceremonies removed to a grave of type 1. Lying within the same general area of the cemetery, but a little to the north of graves of types 1 and 2, there were a series of round or ovoid pits, not rectangular as in the case of type 1, which have been assigned to type 3. The diameter or the longer axis of these pits measured from 2 meters to 2.5 meters, while the depth was about 40 to 60 centimeters. Of this type, as many as 16 examples were exposed, but in none of these were any skeletal remains found, except for a tiny unidentifiable piece in one case. At the same time, certain objects such as beads, copper rings and shell bangles were there. There also were good many pots, amongst which a large globular jar was conspicuous by its size. It was thought that this may have contained ashes, if this particular type represented post-cremation burials. But no ashes could be clearly identified, unless these had got badly mixed up with the earth inside. In an alternative, were the graves of type 3 symbolic, associated with someone who had died elsewhere and whose body could not be recovered? Indeed, one guess is as good as or bad as any other. The Kalibangan burials have also yielded some other interesting information. For example, in one burial, a child was found with a swollen head. It was perhaps a case in which excessive accumulation of water in the brain cells caused the swelling. In the right temporal region of the skull, 3 small holes were noticed, which may have been bored by the Kalibangan surgeon to drain the excessive fluid out. Also noted was a black line joining 2 of the holes, in fact going a bit beyond them. This would indicate that the treatment included the insensitization of the nerves concerned by branding them with a fine instrument after heating it. Examples of trephination have also been found in Neolithic context at Burzahom and in a Harappan context at Lothal. Located in Rohtak district of Haryana, Farmana has yielded a large number of Harappan burials. These have been classified by the excavators into 3 categories vis-a-vis primary, symbolic and secondary. The first 2 categories are similar in nature to types 1 and 3 of Kalibangan, types 1 and 3. However, the third category of Farmana differs from type 2 of Kalibangan, since whereas the former did contain a few bones, the Kalibangan examples did not yield any. Now the economy, which we will get to in the next video.